Hello, everybody. Good afternoon here in Geneva. Good morning in Vermont. My name is Marlene Sahakian, and I'm really delighted to be hosting this lecture today with Oksana Pidou on the question of more than human well-being. We are very interested here in questions around sustainability, prosperity, well-being, but we have come to realize that many of our approaches to well-being have really placed human well-being as the ultimate aim, using capabilities approaches, needs-based approaches, or some combination thereof. And so we've been attracted to and interested in learning more about other approaches to well-being where either animals or mountains or who knows, maybe even technologies could have more agency when it comes to thinking about who lives a good life. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Kristian Brevik. Kristian, we're really delighted to have you with us. Kristian is an artist, a scientist, a writer. He has these wonderful zines that capture many philosophical thoughts about more than human well-being, and works himself at the intersection of multi-species relating and draws from ecological philosophy, evolutionary sciences, and as he says in his bio, just sitting around and looking at insects. So Kristian has the floor for about 40 minutes. And then I will give the floor to Oksana Pidou, who has prepared about 10 minutes as a discussant, and then we will open the floor to a broader discussion. So the floor is yours, Kristian, and thank you so much for being with us this afternoon or morning, your time.
Yep, yeah, morning here in Vermont still, just about. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. I was really looking forward to sort of sharing some of this work with you all, and looking forward to sort of learning more about what you're doing and how these different things can sort of relate and intersect. So I'm happy to be here. So this work I have been doing since about 2018, sort of coming from the world of, my background's more in the sort of quote unquote hard sciences in evolutionary biology and ecology, and then moving more into the environmental humanities. And then a lot of this work was really developed at the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics here with a number of other fellow grad students at the time. And so, and through some of the different ecological economics conferences. So that's kind of where these initial conversations got started, and especially kind of this question of, well, it doesn't really seem like we're really taking into account other species when we're looking at all these different questions that would really maybe help us get. So some background, this is from an environmental studies course that I taught last fall. And this is kind of the background on some of where I'm thinking about this, right? So we have in some measures of the world, in some corners of the world, this framing of, well, things have really gotten better for humans since 1990. And so, right, we have poverty and hunger have declined, lifespans have increased, smoking's gone down. There's a lot of progress on disease for humans, maternal death is down, clean water is better. And so, and this is a quote from a book by Sarah Jaquette Ray about sort of the sort of dealing with the emotional outcomes of thinking about climate change. And this sentiment, I think, is interesting, right? This idea, well, climate change is a challenge, but overall, we do seem to be doing a good job of improving the quality of human life. And so going from there, and this is kind of thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, right? We see there's 17 of these, if folks are familiar with them, but really only 3, climate action, life below water, and life on land, really have anything to do with any other species other than humans. So climate action, I give half an arrow because you could do that in a totally just only for humans consideration. And then the other 2 are focused on that. And I've had students sort of independently come to the same critique of these goals. So when we think about these goals and this idea of human being having increased since in the past 30 to 50 years, if folks are familiar with the concept of the Great Acceleration, since World War II, we have great acceleration of human resource use and impact since World War II. And I didn't put those graphs here. But when we look at how other species have fared since 1970 in the last 50 years, we don't have such a great picture. We have big declines in terrestrial mammals, in freshwater species, in marine species. Bird populations have gone down significantly in the US, and we have sort of what people call the insect population collapse that folks find both in places heavily impacted by agriculture and sort of surprisingly in places that we wouldn't expect these populations to decline. So this is a graph from the bird declines in the United States and Canada. So overall, we have big declines in bird populations since the 1970s. And then this is it broken out by habitat. So we have all the different habitats that birds tend to live in and their populations. And we see one exception to this decline in population of birds, and that's in wetlands. And the reason for that is kind of surprising to me, or it was surprising to me. So we have losses of population in all habitats except for wetlands. And part of the reason for this is that wetland birds and human hunters have sort of a powerful relationship there. So my dad was a duck hunter, so I grew up doing this with him sometimes. And it's really because of hunters and landowners and people who wanted to have a very physical relationship with birds, with waterfowl, that the bird populations are also thriving for these species. So this kind of complicates our idea of distant conservation and also complicates our idea of what is well-being. If hunting leads to well-being, then that's a bit different than how we might approach other framings. And so I don't know if folks are familiar with Donald Rumsfeld. He was the Secretary of Defense in the United States during the Iraq War. And he said, you don't go to war with the army you have, you go to war with the army, or you don't go to war with the army you want, you go to war with the army that you have. And so this, I think, is sort of shift this analogy to, we go to multi-species related with the philosophies we have, not necessarily the philosophies we might want if we could reimagine everything and start from some other position. So this is a slide I thought I'd put in here of really the folks of where can we learn from? Who can we learn from on how we can move towards the sort of like relational well-being approaches when we're thinking about other species. And if folks want to screenshot this, that's a good idea. I could also share a syllabus, like sort of a course reading list that has a lot of these authors on it. And so these are some of the folks that I'm really drawing from when I'm thinking about this work. So a lot of North American indigenous authors. So place thought is a term that Vanessa Watts, the second author, uses to describe sort of philosophy in North America as really being emergent from place, right? It is really the relationships of people and other species in a place where a philosophy emerges, rather than sort of just isolated in someone's brain in a room somewhere. And then we have European philosophy. So stuff like Tim Morton, a couple other names that aren't on here, David Abrams, and others. And then ecology and evolution, really drawing from that world. Ecofeminism, especially Val Plumwood. Some worlds in the multi-species ethnography world, and then process relational philosophy, including Eduardo Kohn, if folks have read How Forests Think. So sort of really drawing from sort of anthropology, and a number of different fields really all touch a little bit on this, and sort of weaving them together into a a way that we can think about them in sort of a really applied fashion. So many people have read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I would definitely recommend that as well. And this quote from her I really found pretty significant. Is what's good for life is good for all life, whether it's green or two-legged or any other kind. Obviously, there are trade-offs. The individual fish doesn't flourish when it's being eaten by the fisherman, but human flourishing and fish flourishing must be mutually reinforcing, or we wouldn't both still be here, right? And here's a picture of my partner catching a cod. We were up in Canada last summer. And then this is a book that recently came out by Emma Maris. So really thinking about how we work on sort of multi-species relating in sort of a multi-species world. And kind of the balance between individuals and flows of energy in ecosystems. And these are kind of hard, these sort of difficult questions to think about and balance. But importantly, thinking about this idea that many of the arguments for human value, or in this case, maybe human well-being, also apply to other species. And so we don't necessarily need to come up with a totally new system, but think about what are the systems or the ways that we are thinking about humans that we can sort of include other beings in. And so rather than trying to come up with this, right, have this idea that there's a lot of folks spend a lot of energy really trying and have for 2,000 years of Western philosophy, trying to make sure that humans maintain separate and on top, right? We have I owe this sort of analysis to Val Plumwood and sort of ecofeminism, which relates, right? We have these systems of hierarchy and they get applied in many contexts. So men over women, humans over other species, and the sort of the logics are very similar. So from that, one of the core values and core like sort of framings that I use and my collaborators have used for trying to like have a sort of a touchstone when we sort of were working about this is that there is no magic wall. And this is kind of where what I've often found in the literature is that folks would get really, really close to including other species. But then at the end of the day, it's always human well-being first. There's always that. And then that's sort of humans first, humans always, right? There's this separation that always kind of comes in at the end. And so in this picture here, black and white, right, we see in many framings like ecosystem services, right? It's all these arrows that flow from other species to human well-being, one-way arrows, right? There's no arrows going back from humans to other species or other ecosystems, which might be in many indigenous frameworks, right? There's a much more of a reciprocal relationship there and you can see in the picture here that I did, it's really, right, where humans and non-humans are deeply interwoven in deep relationships and well-being flows from being to being, right? So if we have, kelp, and kelp might have well-being that flows to otters, and otters has well-being that flows to sharks. And right, we have these flows that are often considered energy flows, but if you're a being really immersed in that world, then you're eating dinner, right? And that is a form of well-being. So these is just sort of a list of terms that in the green, a number of authors have identified this similar phenomenon that's really sort of dominant and are dominant in our ways of relating, right? This illusion of separation, the insuperable line, the sort of species loneliness, disassociation. And so really part of this is like just kind of remembering that this stuff doesn't have evidence. We don't have evidence that humans are separate from other species. This is kind of feels like maybe a little bit of a digression, but it's hard to I find it often hard to remember, right? So relationship in this sort of world of multi-species relating is kind of like the core foundation of where this work is coming from. And and I think what's important about this is there's no way out of it. Like, we have to do it, because when these are just three of the kind of dimensions of this that I kind of come back to when thinking about why it's important to, or why, well, like, multi-species well-being is well-being, and just human well-being is, you know, not accounting for all of everything, right? So we know now that our bodies are, right, like, we have gut microbes in our body that influences our cognition and our moods. Their well-being is our well-being. We have our cells, our mitochondria. This is an ancient symbiosis. And much of our DNA is also viral DNA. So there's not even really, in this way, a human that's separable from other forms of well-being. Right, we share common ancestors through evolution. We owe Darwin a lot for this. Right, we think of, oh, well, humans, they're a separate species, but then we go back and we find that some humans have Neanderthal ancestors and others don't. So then how do we deal with these sort of complex species boundaries? And then sort of this idea of characteristics, right? There's often this framing of, well, there's something special about humans that makes it so that humans are separate in some way, either tools or language or emotion or something else. But when we look, we end up finding that we don't actually find anything that is unique to humans. There obviously, every species is unique in their own way, and humans aren't uniquely unique, is kind of a way that folks have said it, right? Like, every individual and every being is has their own qualities, but do any of those qualities justify moral superiority over any other being? Harder to find evidence for that, I think. So what justification is there for not including other species? That, I think, is kind of the burden of proof that I'm trying to work with, right? Like, how do we justify if we're not going to include other species in the way we're thinking about well-being, other than sort of just a separation argument that I think is hard to hold up? So I wanted to talk a little bit about two different papers that this was actually just accepted earlier this week, and then another one that is still sort of in the works on how we can implement these ideas. So this, I think, will be out in Elementa soon. And so this was three collaborators and I worked on this, thinking about agriculture, sort of animal agriculture, insects in agriculture, which is my background, relationships with soil and energy flows in soil, and then monetary policy, sort of ecofeminist monetary policy. So thinking about how we implement these ideas in these different fields. And so this is kind of and I can share a draft with folks too. We kind of did this like dialogue process where we looked through and talked about these different ideas in different fields, and thought about how we can really take these sort of different ways of relating and how might they apply to these different fields. So there's no sort of answers here in this, but different approaches and sort of pathways forward for how we might think about it. I have a few slides in here kind of on like questions that are still ongoing. One of those, how do we measure well-being? And so one approach that is from the European tradition, really. It's from Yuxkel, Heidegger, and Tim Morton. So this is European philosophical traditions, is this idea of Umwelt, right? The idea of that this sort of that each being has their own world, their own shared experience and experience of the world, and you can't access anyone else's experience of the world. So we often think of that, and this was kind of some dead ends in European philosophy, that humans had the best experience of the world and all other species kind of had a less good version. And this is still often the case. I think people think this, but really, a rabbit has a 100% perfect rabbit experience of the world, just as humans have a human experience of the world. And then a few authors that we've seen before, sort of situated knowledges, which is related to that, and sort of thinking about all of our framings being from a place. So this is sort of a case study, sort of the link, sort of most in-depth case study that has happened so far that we've been working on. So North Atlantic right whales they're a species of whale that lives up and down the east coast of North America. And these are they were in Europe, but they were whaled out there along about in the 1600s, I think, by Basque whalers. Their name, the right whale, is because they were the right whale to hunt. They were slow and they floated when they died, so they've been heavily whaled. They have recovered since whaling stopped to about 350 whales currently alive, but that population is in decline, and the species is in danger of extinction. And there's two main reasons for that, and I'll just talk about entanglement today. The other is ship strikes, being hit by ships. So most whales of these 350 have been entangled in whales, sometimes many times, and the ropes get entangled in their mouths. They get wrapped around their flippers and tails, and leads often to a very slow, painful death for these whales. And the fishing gear that is used for this is crab and lobster fishing gear. So this is a little diagram of sort of how crab and lobster fishing works. Right, so we have this surface buoy, and then a long rope, and then the trap down on the bottom of the sea floor. And so then the ship can come back and pick up the buoy. That's how they know where the trap is, and then they can pick up and collect the lobsters or the crabs. So you can see here, this problem is these vertical lines of rope hanging in the ocean. And when the season's open for these, there are a lot of ropes in the water. And so whales will swim and hit these lines, and then sort of end up wrapping themselves up in these lines, which are a plastic heavy rope that does not biodegrade. And that sort of and then they're often dragging these traps around with them, which are very heavy. Sometimes if they're a calf, they'll just drown because they won't be able to get to the surface. Other times the ropes will eventually fray. But the conversations around this issue is largely sort of fishermen versus whales. And we often, in this case, the conversation is largely about money and the economic impacts that any shift or change in fishing would have on the human fishers. So this paper has been sort of going around we've been working on it for a while, kind of got derailed by the pandemic, but hopefully it'll get out there someday soon. And so the framing we take here is really coming from this like core observation that whales don't use money. And so any assessment of well-being that is really focused on the economic framing, or even trying to turn well-being into money, which I think that's an approach we thought of doing at the beginning. Like, how would you figure out how would you compensate a whale for the injury caused? And you can't really, because they don't use money. And I think this is also related, folks might know more about this too. I was thinking about sort of how some countries have moved from gross national product to gross national happiness, right? Like thinking about how do we get away from trying to use money as our sort of technology of measuring well-being. So this is the approach that we sort of came up with in attempting how to, in this specific case. So what we tried to do here is this is current fishing methods, and then we also expanded that to other fishing methods to try to do a sort of comparison of different options for sort of how we could fish for crab and lobster. And then here we sort of tried to assess well-being on a number of different categories for North Atlantic right whales and human fishers. So these are sort of subjectively oriented those in sort of decreasing order of what we thought was important. from species survival, freedom from injury, pain, and stress, quality of life, access to food, ecosystem health, maintenance of culture, and access to money. And kind of this from the middle here out. And then the color sort of indicating the magnitude of that. So in this case, right, we have the current fishing methods are pushing right whales towards extinction, but humans are unlikely to be go extinct due to these fishing methods, right? So a pretty severe unbalance of well-being there. And then for injury and pain, there is, risk of injury in any of these sort of physical trades, but significantly less than the whales experience. And then sort of down, continuing down this graph here. And here we see our attempt, sort of an initial attempt without a ton of data collection on this, right? So this is one of those questions of how do we assess well-being, of looking at a few different options for how to deal with this issue. So on the top right here, we have weaker rope. This is a proposal to maybe use rope that's not as strong so the whales can get out of it more easily. So we do see with this, we sort of did educated guessing on this based on what we see from out in the water, that some of these metrics would improve, but some of them not so much. And then fishing closures, so no fishing, right? We see pretty good benefits for whales, but it's also pretty severe impacts on human fishers, right? They're not able to fish or provide food to their communities in that way. And maintenance of culture is also low there too. And then this fourth option here, ropeless gear. So I won't get into the details of that, but it's basically a buoy, sort of an inflatable buoy on the lobster trap that then sort of floats up to the top. So there's no rope involved. So this is an expensive technology that's still in development, which is why folks aren't using it. But you can see that if we think about what are the well-being impacts, right? So human fishers are making less money because they need to spend more on this new gear, but we can see that there's a lot more green bars here for both species involved in this case. So one of the sort of questions we had here, right, is how do we get these numbers? And so that's something that I think we're still working on. I think ideally we'd be working with folks who do have a specific knowledge of whales and whale well-being. So that's something that we'd like to work on in the future. I think the pandemic kind of got in the way of some of those goals. But right, so this goes from Max Liberone. So Max is an Indigenous scientist in Newfoundland in Canada. And in their book, Pollution is Colonialism, really it's important to this is thinking about specificity and scale. And so we know that we have different obligations to different beings. So rather than saying we, right, we have we as in, we often think of we as all humans, or thinking about who is we when we're talking about we, right? But an elder daughter has different obligations to you than a male carer. And you have different obligations to your older daughter than to the male carer. Sort of DuPont, a chemical company, has different obligations to plastic pollution than someone with a disability who uses a straw to drink. So even though this framework of everything is related, that comes from many indigenous cosmologies, it doesn't mean that all relationships are the same. We don't have the same obligations, rights, and responsibilities when we are relating to different beings. And so we need, right, like this is an important piece of this, is this idea of specificity when we're talking about trying to understand well-being and relationships. So some of the kind of current questions that I've been thinking about, just to kind of wrap things up. One is, who can assess well-being of other species, and how do we do that? Important to note, I think, is that we already do this for some other species and for other humans who can't talk, and sort of give us a verbal response on what their well-being is. Like human babies, right? We're pretty good at understanding how their well-being is, even if they're not able to verbalize that. And then multi-species communication is sort of how do we know if our attempts to improve well-being are working, right? So some options are kind of attention to thriving, observational behavior, sort of understanding other beings, how they're behaving, and are they does their well-being seem to be improving based on what we can measure, and then in some cases population numbers. And just a little aside on the zines, right? Like part of this is communicating, right? We're trying to communicate to other species, but we're also trying to communicate with other humans, and most humans are not in academia and they're not going to read papers, but most people do have an innate sense of multi-species care. When I talk and teach, folks will often reminisce about their childhood and how they had this ethic of care towards other species, which then they were then taught was sort of unfeasible or wrong or wasn't going to work. So I think the zines are kind of one approach towards connecting with the broader public, many of whom sort of have this innate sense that multi-species well-being does matter. Oh yes, I think this is the slide I updated. So there's a few more authors that I failed to put on the previous version, but it's basically the same slide as before. For folks who are looking at sort of who I'm drawing from for this, these are some of those names. And then here's my email. So yeah, I'm like definitely interested in collaboration and working on how these approaches might be able to work with other approaches and how we can think about, so I know folks who are working on human well-being have much more in-depth sort of knowledge and skill on this.
Thank you so much, Kristian. Round of applause here.
Yeah, thank you.
Before we turn to questions from the audience, I'm very pleased to introduce Oksane Pidou, who is just starting a PhD here at the University of Geneva and is very interested in more than human well-being and has started to foray the literature. And so she will have about 10 minutes to share with us her reflections on this question, and then we'll open up to a broader discussion. The floor is yours, Oksane.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Kristian, for this very stimulating presentation. I'm sure that many of us are here to ask you questions, but let me first present you my understanding of the place that your work take in the state of the art of human, more than human well-being. So we are here today to talk about a topic that has a long history in conservancy, but that is quite recent to sociology, for sociology. And I think here is an emerging, I think that here we can all agree that there is an emerging process. Okay, do you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in questioning the capacity of our modern society to allow collectivities to flourish in well-being, it was first necessary to understand and show that the well-being cannot be measured solely by economic growth. So today, more and more social scientists who use human needs to define well-being consider that it is inextricably linked to the quality of the environment, and that its degradation, of course, necessarily leads to the degradation of human well-being. So in the face of the demise of global biodiversity, the concept of ecosystem services seems to finally justify a change of attitudes long awaited by conservationists towards nature and its non-human inhabitants. Although still driven by instrumentalist values that are characteristic of anthropocentrism, it is finally fashionable to aim at protecting nature and the well-being of others, because it's a matter of its proper functioning. But how can we think about non-human well-being when our globalized culture hyper-separates, as Val Plumwood said, the human being from all others, when it traps us into a dualism which separates the matter from the spirit by erecting a single Western science, which is the only one capable of producing knowledge. It seems that in order to answer these questions, three pathways may be useful and necessary, although they are not always achievable simultaneously. Namely, rethink, colonize, politicize. It is a matter of rethinking. Our ontology and epistemology, of decolonizing our governance and management practices, and finally, of politicizing non-human well-being. For Johanna Latimer and Mara Milley, we need new understandings of the human-non-human relation in the production of knowledge and in its application as technology. Latimer and Milley also questioned the process that helped produce techniques of detachment in the natural and social sciences, and they recommend to bring affect back into science. Others have asked for compassionate conservancy, more than human solidarity, and to attempt nature through engaged empathy. Indigenous and some non-indigenous scholars would add that it's not only about inventing new ways of doing science, but to legitimate and integrate in our framework knowledges that already exist in ontologies of native people around the world. So decolonizing the Western idea of rationality would open new paths for understanding and caring for the non-human worlds. Moreover, beyond the environmental and social justice that decolonization of governance and management practices would bring, it seems that the recourse to indigenous ontologies would enrich the narrow view of the Western world and break its magic wall. But what can we do about the narratives of the world that we have in Europe here, for example? We cannot use indigenous and living ontologies to look after non-humans without taking the risk of cultural appropriation. Therefore, a politicization of non-human well-being based on intrinsic and especially relational values of nature could allow us to avoid this risk. This is where, as I understand it, your work contributes the most to the more than human well-being field of inquiry, while your framework proposal is an innovative way to assess human and individual non-human well-being. You stood against the anthropomorphism critic by assertively position yourself on the side of subjective well-being. And I loved how you say that, and I quote, even if it's not possible for us as humans to fully understand what well-being means to others, to say that we cannot understand at all is disingenuous. And as I use myself the human needs approach to study well-being, and since I'm expanding my scientific interest in well-being to more than humans, I was really excited to encounter your work. So please let me ask you a few questions before I turn the floor over the audience. So in the paper on whales and fishers' well-being, where you examined whales' needs, you and your team included primarily physiological and safety needs. As you said, that these are the needs that can best be estimated by humans for whales. You also mentioned that higher order needs were addressed briefly in two broad categories, So can you explain what categories there were? Because I could not find it anywhere in the paper. And also, I would like to ask, why have you ended up using the Maslow pyramid over more recent and perhaps less controversial for social scientists approaches of human fundamental needs? And a few more questions, and then that's it for me. In the literature, I could see that even while considering well-being for others, we tend to make a hierarchy that gives priority to sentient and more often animals. What do you think about it? How can we take care and methodologically account for the well-being of plants and small beings like insects, especially in an urban context? And lastly, I also want to ask you frankly, what about crabs and lobsters' well-being? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. And those are some great questions. Yeah, thank you for that response. Yeah, so this, I think I'll start with the crabs and lobsters. So that was something, we had a number of conversations around that. And I think that there was kind of like, I guess, two things come to mind. One is the sort of like individual, this is sort of this tension we have between individual well-being and then like ecosystem or energy flow well-being, systemic well-being. And so I think in this case, it was like, if these relationships are not necessarily harming populations, in some ways, then maybe there is some then that is flourishing for crabs and lobsters, when we try to minimize sort of suffering outside of death. When we think of, right, so death is a very sort of challenging aspect to this, right? We have all these metrics of well-being, that are sort of about subjective experience. Death is a bit strange in that, because you kind of lose subjective experience when a being dies and it becomes another being. And then I also think in this case, I think our final conclusion from all these conversations was that we didn't know what to do, really. We kind of felt like we needed like that to sort of open up a conversation with a wide number of people that I guess it was a bit strategic, right? Like folks already have a sense of whales and sort of their poster child for environmentalism and sort of their close similarity to humans. So then there was sort of a strategic attempt there, right, to open up this conversation to others with something that folks felt would be sort of an accessible approach towards first start with whales, and then once we get whales, then we'll go another step, and then we'll sort of widen out into the ecosystem, which that really addressed, that sort of points to your second question there, is like, how can we manage with these hierarchies we already have of mammals, right? We have the great chain of being, like mammals, birds, fish, insects, rocks, all the way down, right? And then also a hierarchy of humans on top of that. So I think this question it does relate right to that strategic choice of choosing our audience. We assumed would have an empathy with whales and would be able to connect with this framework with that.
Recording in progress.
And then also it's a sort of easier for us to assess well-being for beings who are closer to us, just based on our shared bodies and similarities. But I do think that, right, like this question of specificity, it also sort of makes me think about that, right? We have sort of maybe a closer assessment of well-being for the beings that we have sort of day-to-day relationships with, and have more of a connection to, right? And so in some cases, right? Like I don't have many day-to-day interactions with whales, but I do have day-to-day interactions with birds in the yard or fish or insects. And so I can more like better assess those beings' well-being. So in some ways, I think that when we talk about sort of plants and small beings, I think one of my sort of approaches, right, which both gets to this question of hierarchy and gets to this question of how do we do this when we are pretty sort of hyper separated philosophically, but also like pretty separated in our day-to-day relationships. Like we're not relating to most species when they're alive. We're relating to a lot of species every day when we eat them. And so one of the approaches I have in this class I did, which I felt worked pretty well, right, is a series of sort of practices for starting to relate with the beings who are closest to us that we're already in a relationship with. Right. So this is the beings we eat every day, sort of thinking about where they came from, thinking about their lives and thanking them when we're eating them. And then when we're encountering squirrels or small beings around urban areas, when we encounter insects when they land on us, and when there's spiders and other arthropods in our house, is being very aware of sort of sitting with them, thinking with them, trying to assess what are their well-being needs in this situation, right? There's a spider in our shower. Why are they here? What are they enjoying about this? What ecosystem services am I providing to them? And what ecosystem services might be they providing to us? Like how is our well-being entangled? In some ways, I think we're so distant from sort of a clear resolution to this that those sorts of practices, getting us to even think about it on a daily basis, feels like a step in the right direction, more than having a solution necessarily at this moment. Because I think you, as you mentioned, ecosystem services, which was one of the first sort of frameworks that sort of I found frustrating that it didn't include other species, but I also found that it's like not difficult to make it account for other species, because once you realize that humans benefit from ecosystem services, then you also realize that whales and lions and trees also benefit from ecosystem services. And including the ecosystem services that humans provide. So the simple way I put it is kind of almost most of the literature out there on ecosystem services just say, oh, this is human ecosystem services. And then we can go and look at oak trees and see, well, what are the ecosystem services that oak trees receive from other beings and species? And we can kind of think about that. And then for the methodological questions, that I don't remember, and I'd love to work on picking up something that might be more sort of more well-studied or critiqued, or that folks are using more now.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Kristian. There is a note in the discussion that I was trying to find on my computer. Okay, someone's moving. So are there other questions, or does anyone have questions from among the people online or in the room? Julian has a question.
Yeah, quick question. Thank you very much.
Can you hear?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. It was super interesting, and I especially like the fact that you're trying to, with your study on the whale, to evaluate the concrete, implication of change our perspective on animal well-being, more generally speaking, human and more than human well-being. I just have one question regarding this super interesting example regarding the human fisherman and the whales. As far as I understood your example, the whale still has an instrumental value to the fisherman well-being because it can be killed by the fisherman, right? But the opposite is not existing, right? The whale cannot, or we shouldn't be able to kill fishermen, I guess, to increase whales' well-being, if you see what I mean. So
Yes, yeah, so asymmetrical.
can we still get this new ontology, about like modern human well-being, and at the same time maintain this idea of animals having an instrumental value to human well-being? And I hope I made myself clear with that question.
Yeah, so kind of saying that in this case, like there's an asymmetry, and that like whales can be killed, but humans can't be killed, kind of or their whales, their death is sort of acceptable in the system, and human death is not acceptable in the system.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that is a good question. Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer other than trying to yeah, kind of remove that. I think in this case, right, like the if we don't allow there to be that instrumental value, then it makes sense to stop fishing immediately, right? Like that's kind of the, like if whale deaths were treated on the same level as human deaths, then like there'd be we'd probably have stopped doing this type of fishing.
Can I add quickly something? I'm really not vegan, but is there any good argument if we really think about this modern human well-being for not all becoming vegans? Is there a strong argument against this?
Yeah, so I think there's a few arguments that I could share. So one is that the so environments where there is like these sort of humans eating other species relationships, often that leads to thriving for other species, whereas human separation from those environments often leads to decreases in well-being for those species, because there's not the sort of relational approach towards well-being. I think veganism in general, I would say my main critique of that is it still relies on the sort of Platonic hierarchy of animals and then plants, and so allows plants to be sort of killable and above moral concern, and doesn't really account for also the land relationships for how those plants are produced, right? So plants are produced on land that was taken from multi-species collectives, and so there is some that relationship is often not accounted for. And I think it's also tricky if we don't think humans are special in the way that we eat, then how do we deal with predators? So this question of like, should we kill all predators so that no one gets eaten? So I think that is a trickier kind of ethical question. So like if humans are hunting deer, or if wolves are hunting deer, what are the well-being outcomes for the deer? Because oftentimes if humans are in those relationships, like we saw with the ducks, right, it often might be more well-being overall for the deer, even though there's these predation relationships. And I think also in a little bit of a sort of more philosophical deep time approach, like predation and evolution is how we all exist. Deers run fast because wolves run fast. And so predation we all create each other constantly from these ecological relationships. So trying to sever those and pretend that ecological relationships don't exist feels tricky to me, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I think Clémentine had a question.
Yes, thanks for this talk and ideas. I think it's pretty inspiring because if I was trying to apply this idea to the canton of Geneva, perhaps we wouldn't take whales, perhaps all species on the canton of Geneva, and then we could perhaps try to illustrate the well-being, the number of species, etc., and their trends, as opposed to that of humans. Perhaps it's a very powerful way to talk to humans and to make them realize they need to do something. And my question is, at the moment, we use climate change as sort of the tip of the iceberg of all the different Earth processes that we should be protecting. And this would be sort of shifting the point of the iceberg and using biodiversity rather at the front, because it's a good picture. Do you agree with this idea? And what do you do with the other Earth processes? Should you keep them in the picture or not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the first thing that comes to mind is Emma Maris's book, the Wild Souls, right? So I think I think it's kind of, it might leave climate change still sort of up there on the list of sort of things to deal with, given the sort of like widespread and significant impacts to well-being for so many species. It's still like, for me, it still feels like kind of, if we want to maintain well-being for the most species possible, it does feel like climate change still stays at the top of the list, but it kind of like, it adds a level of like more, maybe more like moral clarity to it when we're thinking about like realizing like, oh, this is not just going to impact humans who might be able to, in some cases, move or rely on some support in some other ways, but many species won't have support from other humans, even to the limited extent that it might happen. So yeah, does that answer your question at all?
Here in Switzerland, more and more the message from scientists is that they are two sides of the same coin. Biodiversity loss and climate change were presented together to the Swiss Parliament, because oftentimes when climate change was presented alone, one way of not addressing climate change was by saying, well, actually, shouldn't we be focusing on biodiversity loss? So scientists sort of came together and said we must be presenting them as the same or a common problem.
Mm-hmm.
But I
Yeah.
like your point, Kristian, because indeed adaptation is not something we ever think about, or I've never seen works consider non-human adaptation. Adaptation really is understood as human adaptation to climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Are there questions? Oh, Nicolas has a question, another colleague here at the University of Geneva. And if there are people on the Zoom that want to ask questions, please don't hesitate.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. Do you hear me well? Do you hear me properly?
Yeah.
Great. My question has to do with the two related questions. Whether you're familiar with the concept of legal animism, that is giving personhood to different entities of nature or even ecosystems. This has appeared in different systems of law, in contentious cases, in constitutional rights, but also in regulation. For instance, in Europe, saying that the hens have to have enough space in order to be respected in their well-being or in their henning, in their being hens. Mm-hmm. So this led a legal scholar, French legal scholar, Marie-Angèle Hermite, to talk about a legal animism of a scientific basis in contrast to legal animism on religious or cultural, it was religious and yes, there's another one, religious basis and cultural, let's call it. It's like the one that one can see in New Zealand, autochthonous peoples that have historical relations with nature that are embedded in this kind of animism. And in India also there is what is called the religious animism. So for the West, it would be the scientific-based legal animism. And my question here has to do with how is calculated or described the well-being that I saw in the bar chart that describes the progression. Is that decline in a sort of indicators of well-being, like the centimeters that the hen has to hen, or how is that implemented? I can imagine so an horizon of this in the construction of rights of nature or rights of animals could lead to NGOs to use these measures in contentious cases to claim for animal well-being through legal mechanisms that could eventually appear. So that's what my interest was in the construction of those indicators.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, the construction of those indicators kind of was one of the kind of roadblocks that we ran into in this. And our original plan was to work with, there's a group, there's a North Atlantic right whale consortium, which is a group of a few hundred scientists and folks who work on sort of research and animal welfare for these whales. And so the goal there was to, and I think a goal would still be to work with that community to come up with sort of a transparent process for how these different things are measured, and using any sort of scientific or other information that's available on that. And so I think kind of this taking a lot of people who know a lot and have a lot of information about it and trying to synthesize all their knowledge together. I think that was kind of the approach that we had intended to, and the bar charts as they are kind of our small groups attempt to try to get close to that, or what we might have thought there. But I do think that this framework, right, the scientific basis for animism, I do think that does seem like it holds a fair amount of promise, in that it's tough that we have to like kind of justify every species as we go in some way, rather than kind of starting from a place where we're accounting for all those well-being. We have to go case by case. But yeah, Robin Wall Kimmerer says, like, there are no studies that show that any animal or any being is dumber than we thought, right? Like, we continue to find more research about, rats rescuing each other and showing empathy, and fish showing fear when they're sort of near other fish who are scared, and things like that. So I do think that part of it is, like, if we took the science seriously, even though we already have, I think we would have like pretty, it sort of justifies that animism.
Valerie has a question. Thank you so much for your super interesting presentation. I have so many questions, and then I tried to formulate one as much as I could.
Right.
I really enjoyed how you present your research around the well-being of the whale and the fishermen, but I wonder, what do you think is the benefit of picking one species over a more, let's say, a whole ecosystem well-being approach? Is it related to the way that we understand species as a, or by biology or the science? And I asked this question because actually I read this morning how ocean cleanup efforts could be potentially very detrimental to surface ecosystem of the sea, which then, impact the well-being of fish and then whale, and also, the bird species and all that. Well, it could be also beneficial for other species who are harmed by this, ocean plastics. So I'm just saying, since we all know that humans, more than human species, we all live in an ecosystem, are there approaches to, let's say, a more systemic approach to ecosystem well-being? And then how do you plan to engage that, if so, in future research?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, to that, I think that's a core question, I think, of this work, is how do we balance individual well-being and ecosystem well-being? And I think in this case, I think we started with the whales because it felt like a very compelling and easy to access example. But I do think that that's kind of continue to be sort of an ongoing question of sort of both sort of our priorities, and then sort of assessment of, like, if we focus on individuals, like you say, are there just trade-offs with other individuals? Or if we take an ecosystem approach, do we see sort of more mutual thriving around that? So yeah, I think you sort of identified sort of a core question there. I think the first like one of the other ways I could think to respond to that is that I feel like there's some cases in which our sort of structures, our way of living, are sort of like egregiously harmful to well-being, that it's pretty easy to start with certain things, like factory farming, extracting fossil fuels. Like we can start with those big, easy things. And then that'll give us time to think more about these more detailed, nuanced examples.
Is there a question from the Zoom room? Roberta?
Yes, hi, Marilyn. Thank you so much, Kristian, for the presentation. I'm really inspired, and by what you said, and also by the way you linked science and philosophy and art. I was looking at your art installations before. I'm really impressed. So really, thank you.
Thank you.
I was just thinking very fast throughout the whole process. I'm not sure what my question is. I think it's more to do with this notion of individual. So I just finished reading last week this wonderful book by Merlin Sheldrake. He's a biologist, and he wrote this book called
Entangled Life.
Yes, I just finished reading that, and that was like mind blowing. I'm not a scientist in that sense. I don't study anything that has to do with environmental sciences or biology or whatever. But the book was so inspiring because he really goes to as far to criticize this notion of individual, saying we humans are not individuals. We're just made up of millions of bacteria and other creatures. And that's the same with ecosystems. So every time we privilege individual well-being over ecosystems well-being, it's just, it's a paradox. It's not really privileging individual well-being in any way, because it's all interrelated. And I was also thinking at this like role of science, like listening to science, but again, then I was thinking at Vandana Shiva, when she says actually science is a really short knowledge project that humanity has been using just in humanity history, but indigenous cultures had known since forever that animals have their own intrinsic value. So yeah. So I'm not sure where I'm going with this. Just to say that probably we have forgotten, like culturally, things that we used to know. And the question is more, I would like to go into the roots of what we used to know. You were also mentioning your students having this intuitive understanding of, or this ethic of care for non-human species. So yeah, the question would be, yeah, how do you implement this in your work, like going back to what we used to know and we have forgotten?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you. I think thinking we're actually, like, if you think about our bodies as, we have all these different beings that are a part of us. We're really communities who are members of communities. Like, it's communities all the way down, kind of relationship all the way down. One way to put it. And I think this is a question that I think about too. So there was a recent piece in the New Yorker, which is a magazine here, about sort of how the like political concept of indigeneity emerged over the past few decades. And one of the things that I thought was pretty fascinating there was that folks from Scandinavia moved to Iceland before the Maori emerged in New Zealand, right? So then we have this question. So what makes a community indigenous? And what do we mean by that, right? So I think this article discussed that, right, there's this kind of difficult notion of primitiveness that is still associated with this concept of indigeneity. And so when we're engaged in sort of, and this political concept of what that means. And so I think through this, and I also think looking at Matthew Hall's book, Plants as Persons, is a great book on this. There does seem to be this underlying sense that I have that there is a like underlying truth, for lack of a better word, of this sort of multi-species, like all beings have agency and are emergent out of relationship, and we can communicate and relate in this way that has then kind of been overrun and colonized, right? We have sort of Greek thought and Western philosophy through sort of the monotheistic religions coming out of the Near East. And so, right, so our ancestors in Europe, right, presumably used to have these better relationships with other species, which were lost somehow. It seems like it has something to do maybe with agriculture, something to do with how our societies have sort of have more of a progress based narrative, or money. David Graeber talks about money as sort of this mechanism of separation. So I do think it's worth thinking about sort of how, right, and then we have also there's folks still in Europe and in the US, like pagan religions, Celtic traditions, folks who still have these practices or memories of practices that are very sort of emphasize these multi-species well-being relationships. And so I think part of this project is figuring out, like, where did we start making this weird assumption about humans being separate without any evidence? How do we sort of approach, because I do think that there's a especially in the US, we talk about sort of the relationship between settlers and indigenous people, and I do think that that's kind of a like sort of long and complicated question of how do we think about different knowledge traditions, where they came from, and how can they relate respectfully without appropriating one another. But yeah, this is a great question.
Thank you.
I have a question, two questions. One is more of a request, as we are beginning to explore this question of more than human well-being, and Oksana will try to engage with these frameworks for her PhD thesis and studying the relation between open spaces, adaptation, and more than human well-being. I was really interested in the work that you're doing with your students and how you get them to interrelate and maybe observe and consider this these interdependencies between humans and non-humans, and anything you can share with us methodologically that might inform, for example, walking tours of neighborhoods that we might do with citizens, thinking about hotter summers in Geneva and how they're a given, it's going to be a very situated study. We're going to be looking really at specific neighborhoods, and Oksana is keen on looking at neighborhoods that have some kind of a biodiversity component. So any guidance you can give us on that methodologically would really be keen on. And another question I have for you is, you mentioned Graeber, and I've worked in the past on the social and solidarity economy, which I think has academic research has waned a little bit, perhaps in favor of research around the commons. But this notion of solidarity and reciprocity has been used by people in the solidarity economy to sort of put forward this claim that another world is possible, right? Coming out of the social forum. Have those, because I saw a lot of words used in your slides. I'm just trying to sort of situate this literature in relation to the literature that you've been citing. Are these notions of reciprocity at all being discussed? And is that because if we are thinking of economies as interdependencies and mutually beneficial exchanges, and you know, thinking of Malinowski's work on, you know, the Kula trade, and then taking us to, because I'm sorry, I think I'm thinking as I'm talking, but somehow the danger of only looking at ecosystems without humans is that suddenly you disregard power, right? And it's all about, this is what industrial ecology has tried to do. We're just going to mimic natural systems, and that's how we're going to do industrial symbiosis and all that. So is there a way of maybe thinking about what has been developing in ecological economics and around solidarity economy thinking in relation to reciprocity and applying it to this this approach? I don't even want to call it an ecosystem service approach, because to me that is too instrumental. So I'm trying to find another way. I like the relational approach that you're discussing. Any thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind, I was just talking about this in one of my classes, the word ecosystem and the word economy come from the same Greek word, eco, right? The care of the home, right? So these systems are these ways of like sort of like paying attention to our home, right? Both And so I do think there's continuity between these approaches. And I do think, yeah, the solidarity and reciprocity for sure. I think so. Timothy Morton is an eco-philosopher who writes Humankind, I think, is the one where he talks more about sort of multi-species solidarity. But yeah, so I think I don't have a ton of experience in that world, but I do have some friends who work on sort of like food systems that are outside of the monetary food system, and sort of mutual aid kind of thing, stuff like that. So I do think that there's a total, like a pretty clear continuity between those approaches. And keeping humans in those systems, I think, is very critical, right? Like we're not ever taking humans out of our relationships with other species. We're really keeping them in, right? You have to, like Donna Haraway says, you have to stay with the trouble, right? Like we're in this relationships, and trying to separate them out is not gonna help, I don't think. So I think the trying to find, right, part of this, the idea of the magic wall is thinking like, well, how is reciprocity between humans similar to reciprocity between humans and trees? How is that similar to reciprocity between trees and squirrels, between mountains and trees? How do we think about these like multi-levels? Or the human example is just one version of that could happen in many different ways.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so this methodology of relating, the first thing I think I would say is, so with the caveat that this was like a self-selected group of students who took this class, but it was much easier than I thought it would be. Like it was almost as if it was, I can share the sort of way I presented it in class. So it was along with some readings, which I think some students were saying like, well, we really needed to do these readings to understand what we were doing. But when we were asked to like sit and hang out with the spider in our house, it didn't take very long to realize that they were a being with agency. So I think I think that if you, once you sort of give people permission to relate to other beings, then very quickly they often, at least in my experience, are kind of quickly becomes clear. So I can share some of the stuff that I use with my students, but just sort of being, and often folks will find, and my students did, they'll find it silly to begin with, right? When you ask them, like every day when you pass by a tree that's on your daily walk, say hi, like talk to that tree. They'll say, oh, this was silly. I didn't want people to see me when I was doing this. But after a week of doing it, it felt rude to not acknowledge the tree when I walked past.
Many of us here work with practice theory, habits and routines, and how they're dislodged, and we all always speak about these moments of reflexivity where you try and bring people sort of behind the curtain to think about normative dimensions of everyday life. And so I really like this sort of 1 week challenge of relating to other species. So I think we're gonna try it among our students here.
I can send you what I have. Yeah, I have a series of one week practices that folks do.
I'd love to learn more about that, Kristian. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if anyone else has any other questions from the room or on the Zoom. No? Well, thank you so much for being with us, Kristian, and for sharing your work. It's very inspiring to us. We're definitely going to be continuing with these reflections. Thank you, Oksana, for your wonderful discussion. And without anything more to say, I wish everyone a good day, a good evening, and we'll definitely be keeping in touch and continuing these discussions.
Great.
Bye.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Bye. Yeah. Send me an email if you want to chat.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Arrêtez l'enregistrement. Yes.